The moment I realized something was wrong was not when my family arrived for Thanksgiving. It was when I looked at the empty chair at the end of the table and felt that Harold was trying to warn me. Thanksgiving had always been Harold's favorite holiday. Not Christmas. Not his birthday. Thanksgiving. He loved the simplicity of it. A house full of family, too much food, and stories that somehow became funnier every year. For 43 years, he sat at the head of our dining table carving the turkey while everyone argued over football and pie. Harold's voice would have told me to check the thermostat, to set the napkins higher, to watch the oven. He was in my head like a safety alarm. This year his warning came as silence. The chair remained empty instead. I woke before sunrise that morning. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old floorboards settling in the cold November air. Outside, a thin layer of frost covered the backyard. I wrapped a sweater around my shoulders and walked into the kitchen. There was work to do. The turkey needed attention. The stuffing still had to be finished. The sweet potatoes were waiting on the counter beside the ingredients for Harold's favorite pecan pie recipe. Keeping busy felt easier than thinking. Every corner of the house reminded me that this was my first Thanksgiving as a widow. By 8 o'clock, the kitchen smelled like sage, butter, cinnamon, and roasted turkey. I found myself moving through familiar routines almost automatically. Set the table. Polish the serving dishes. Fold the cloth napkins. Place the candles. Every task carried a memory. Every memory carried Harold. Around noon, I stepped into the dining room and looked at the table. 12 place settings. 12 chairs. 11 guests. 1 empty seat. I had considered removing it. More than once. But each time I tried, something stopped me. So I left it exactly where it had always been. My son Ryan was the first to arrive. He walked through the front door carrying a bottle of wine and greeted me with a hug. It felt good to see him. For a brief moment, the loneliness eased. Then Emily arrived behind him with their 2 children. She smiled warmly and handed me a pumpkin pie from a bakery across town. "You should not have done all this work by yourself," she said. The comment sounded thoughtful. Kind, even. Yet something about the way she looked around the house made me uncomfortable. Her eyes lingered on the walls, the furniture, the staircase. Not long enough to attract attention. Just long enough for me to notice. More family members arrived throughout the afternoon. Laughter gradually filled the rooms. Coats piled up near the front door. Football played quietly on the television in the den. On the surface, everything looked exactly as Thanksgiving should. Yet a strange feeling followed me from room to room. I could not explain it. I only knew it would not leave. Several times, I caught Ryan and Emily exchanging glances. Small looks. Quick looks. The kind people share when they are thinking about something they do not want discussed openly. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief can make ordinary moments feel suspicious. At least that is what I wanted to believe. Then, while carrying a tray of appetizers toward the family room, I noticed something else. The conversation stopped the second I entered. Not gradually. Instantly. Ryan smiled. Emily smiled. Everyone smiled. Yet the silence arrived too quickly. Like a curtain dropping at the end of a performance. I pretended not to notice and continued serving food. But the feeling returned stronger than before. Later, as I stood alone in the kitchen checking the turkey, I glanced through the doorway into the dining room. My eyes settled once more on Harold's empty chair. For reasons I still cannot fully explain, I felt a sudden certainty wash over me. My family had not come to Thanksgiving carrying only casseroles and desserts. Someone had arrived with another purpose entirely. And before the day was over, I was going to discover exactly what it was. By the time everyone gathered around the dining table, the house felt warmer than it had all year. Candles flickered softly between serving dishes, the scent of roasted turkey filled the room, and the familiar sound of overlapping conversations echoed off the walls. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe the uneasy feeling from earlier had been nothing more than grief. Perhaps I was simply missing Harold. Perhaps I was seeing shadows where none existed. We joined hands before dinner, and my granddaughter volunteered to say grace. Her small voice trembled slightly as she thanked God for family, health, and the memories we shared with those who were no longer with us. When she mentioned her grandfather, the table grew quiet. I lowered my eyes and smiled. It was the first truly sincere moment of the day. Dinner began, and conversation slowly returned. Plates were passed from person to person. Someone asked about football. Someone else talked about holiday shopping. The children laughed about school. Everything appeared normal. Yet the longer I listened, the more I noticed something strange. Ryan and Emily were unusually attentive. They refilled my glass before I asked. They complimented the meal repeatedly. Emily praised the house several times throughout dinner. At first, I appreciated the kindness. Then I realized the compliments all seemed to revolve around one specific subject. The property. "This neighborhood has become incredibly valuable," Emily said while passing the cranberry sauce. "Homes around here are selling faster than ever." A few minutes later, Ryan mentioned recent developments being built nearby. Then Emily commented on how large the lot was compared to newer properties. None of those remarks seemed inappropriate on their own. Together, however, they began forming a pattern. I noticed it. Apparently nobody expected me to. After dessert, the family gradually scattered throughout the house. Some moved into the family room to watch football. Others gathered near the fireplace. The grandchildren disappeared upstairs to play games. I carried several empty dishes into the kitchen and began loading the dishwasher. Through the doorway, I could hear conversations drifting from different rooms. Most were ordinary. Then one sentence caught my attention before the next dish was rinsed. It came from the hallway just outside the kitchen. The appraisal should already be finished. The voice was Emily's. I froze for half a second before continuing to rinse a plate. Appraisal. The word landed heavily in my mind. A moment later, Ryan replied in a lower voice that I could not fully hear. Then Emily spoke again. "We just need the timing to work." Timing. Appraisal. Neither word belonged in a casual Thanksgiving conversation. I remained exactly where I was. Neither of them realized I was standing only a few feet away. Their voices dropped even lower. I caught fragments. References to paperwork. Discussions about schedules. Mentions of dates. Not enough to understand everything. Enough to know something was happening. After several seconds, footsteps moved away from the kitchen. The conversation ended. I placed the plate into the dishwasher and stared out the window above the sink. Darkness had settled across the backyard. My reflection looked back at me in the glass. Older. Tired. More alert than I had been all day. I thought about the way Emily kept mentioning property values. I thought about the sudden silence whenever I entered a room. Most of all, I thought about that single word. Appraisal. Nobody orders an appraisal for holiday decorations. Nobody discusses timing and paperwork over turkey and pie without a reason. When I returned to the family room a few minutes later, everyone appeared perfectly relaxed. Ryan smiled at me. Emily offered to help clean up. The children continued laughing. Yet something had changed. Not in them. In me. For the first time all day, I stopped wondering whether my instincts were wrong. I knew they were not. Somewhere beneath the smiles, beneath the holiday traditions, beneath the careful politeness, a plan was quietly unfolding. And I was beginning to suspect that my house stood at the center of it. The rest of Thanksgiving evening passed in a blur of smiles that no longer felt quite real. Once you notice something hidden beneath the surface, it becomes impossible to ignore. Every conversation sounded different. Every glance carried new meaning. Around 8 o'clock, people began gathering coats and leftovers. Containers filled with turkey, stuffing, and pie disappeared into insulated bags. The grandchildren hugged me goodbye before rushing toward the front door. One by one, family members drifted into the cold November night until only Ryan and Emily remained. They lingered longer than everyone else. That alone caught my attention. Usually, they were among the first to leave because the children became tired after a full day of excitement. This year, however, they seemed in no hurry at all. Emily helped clear the dining table while Ryan wandered through the living room carrying a cup of coffee. More than once, I noticed him looking around the house. Not admiring it. Studying it. The distinction was subtle but unmistakable. When people admire a home, they focus on memories. When they evaluate one, they focus on details. Square footage. Layout. Condition. Possibilities. Eventually, Emily joined me in the kitchen while I wrapped leftovers. Her tone remained cheerful. Almost too cheerful. "You really have done an amazing job maintaining this place," she said. "Most homes this age need so much work." I smiled politely. "Your father-in-law took good care of it." She nodded. "It is worth much more than people realize." There it was again. Value. Worth. Property. The conversation always seemed to circle back to the same subject. Before I could respond, Ryan walked into the kitchen holding his empty coffee mug. "Mom," he said casually, "have you ever thought about what you want to do long-term?" I looked up from the counter. "What do you mean?" "The house. Living alone. Future plans." His voice sounded relaxed, but the question felt rehearsed. As though he had been waiting for the right moment to ask it. I placed the lid on a container and turned toward him. "I have not made any decisions." Ryan exchanged a quick glance with Emily. The look lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. "Well," Emily said gently, "you should know that we would always help if you needed anything." Help. Another harmless word carrying unexpected weight. The conversation ended there, but the feeling remained. After they finally left, I locked the front door and stood alone in the quiet house. The silence returned almost immediately. Earlier that morning, the silence had felt lonely. Now it felt useful. My phone screen lit up with a missed call notification from my old attorney, Daniel Brooks. It was 2 days since Harold's funeral, when grief was still sharp enough to make me careless about answering. I scrolled past without thinking, convinced he was calling about nothing important. It gave me space to think. I walked through the dining room collecting forgotten napkins and empty glasses. The candles had nearly burned down. Wax pooled around their bases. At the end of the table sat Harold's empty chair. I paused beside it. The room looked exactly as it had only hours before, yet everything felt different. As I reached for a serving dish, something caught my eye near the sideboard. A folded sheet of paper partially hidden beneath a decorative tray. At first, I assumed someone had left behind a grocery list or a receipt. I picked it up without much thought. Then I noticed several printed words near the top of the page. Property assessment. Market evaluation. Estimated sale range. My heartbeat slowed. Not sped up. Slowed. The way it does when a puzzle piece suddenly finds its place. I lowered myself into a chair and unfolded the document completely. And as my eyes moved across the page, I began to realize that the word appraisal had not been mentioned by accident. For several minutes, I simply sat there holding the document in my hands while the house remained completely silent around me. The appraisal had been completed less than 2 weeks earlier. My address appeared at the top of every page. So did photographs of the house, the property lines, and detailed estimates of its market value. Someone had spent considerable time gathering information. Someone had ordered the evaluation. Someone had planned far enough ahead to know exactly what they wanted. I turned each page slowly. Notes had been highlighted in yellow. Certain sections contained handwritten comments in the margins. Most of the handwriting belonged to Emily. I recognized it immediately from birthday cards and holiday notes she had written over the years. One sentence near the bottom of a page caught my attention. Excellent timing after the holidays. I stared at those words for a long moment. Timing. The same word I had overheard earlier in the hallway. Suddenly, the scattered pieces of the day began fitting together. The unusual kindness. The repeated comments about property values. The discussion about future plans. The secret conversation near the kitchen. None of it had been random. None of it had been accidental. I set the papers on the dining table and walked into Harold's study. The room felt exactly as it always had. Books lined the shelves. His reading lamp sat beside the chair where he spent countless evenings. A framed photograph of our 25th wedding anniversary remained on the desk. I lowered myself into his chair and looked around the room. More than anything, I wished I could ask him what he thought. Harold had always noticed things before anyone else. Small details. Tiny inconsistencies. Changes in behavior that most people ignored. As I sat there, a memory surfaced unexpectedly. About 6 months before he passed away, we had been discussing estate planning over coffee one morning. At the time, I barely paid attention. I trusted him completely. He handled those matters carefully and thoroughly. I remember laughing when he insisted on reviewing documents again. "You act like we are preparing for a courtroom drama," I had teased. Harold smiled and shook his head. "No," he said. "I am preparing for people to be people." The comment seemed strange at the time. Now it echoed in my mind with surprising clarity. People to be people. The next morning, I woke early and read through the appraisal again. This time I noticed something even more interesting. Attached to the final page was a business card from a local real estate consultant. Written across the back were several dates and a phone number. The handwriting belonged to Emily. I felt neither anger nor panic. What I felt was certainty. Whatever plan had been discussed during Thanksgiving did not begin that day. It had started long before anyone sat down at my table. Someone had already gathered information. Someone had already explored options. Someone had already envisioned a future involving decisions about my house without ever speaking to me honestly about it. Later that afternoon, Ryan called. His voice sounded relaxed and cheerful. He asked whether everyone had made it home safely. He complimented the dinner again. Then, almost casually, he mentioned the house. "You know, Mom, Emily and I were talking about how much work a property this size can become." I looked through the kitchen window toward the backyard Harold loved so much. The swing still moved gently in the breeze. "Were you?" I asked. "Just thinking about the future," he replied. "Nothing urgent." Nothing urgent. I almost smiled. The appraisal sitting on my dining table suggested otherwise. As the conversation continued, I listened more carefully than ever before. For the first time, I was no longer searching for clues. I already had them. What I needed now was patience. Because somewhere behind Ryan's carefully chosen words and Emily's rehearsed kindness was the full truth. And I had a feeling that truth was about to reveal itself sooner than either of them expected. 3 days passed after Thanksgiving, and I said nothing about the appraisal. I did not call Ryan. I did not confront Emily. I did not mention the document to anyone. Instead, I watched. Sometimes silence reveals more than questions ever could. During those 3 days, Ryan called twice. Both conversations followed a similar pattern. He asked how I was feeling. He checked whether I needed help around the house. Then, eventually, the discussion drifted toward the future. Not directly. Never directly. Just enough to keep the subject alive. The second call ended with a sentence that stayed with me long afterward. "You know, Mom, you should not have to handle everything alone." The words sounded caring. Yet something about them felt rehearsed. as though they belonged to a conversation that had already been planned. The following Saturday morning, I decided to clean out a kitchen drawer that had become a collection place for old receipts, coupons, and miscellaneous papers. It was the kind of task people postpone for months. While sorting through the contents, I discovered an envelope that did not belong there. At first, I assumed it was another piece of holiday clutter. Then I noticed Emily's handwriting on the front. There was no address. No stamp. Just several handwritten notes. Apparently, it had been mixed into a stack of papers during Thanksgiving and accidentally left behind. I opened it carefully. Inside were several printed pages. The first page appeared to be a checklist. The second contained handwritten notes. The third changed everything. At the top of the page were the words transition options. Beneath them sat a list of possible scenarios regarding my home. Sell property. Relocate Margaret. Purchase smaller residence. Timing considerations. Estimated proceeds. I read every line twice. Then a third time. The notes were not detailed enough to constitute a complete plan, but they revealed something important. Conversations about my future had been happening without me. Not after Thanksgiving. Before Thanksgiving. Long before. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the pages. Outside, the wind rattled the last remaining leaves from the maple tree in the backyard. Inside, a strange calm settled over me. The discovery hurt. Of course it did. Nobody enjoys realizing they have been discussed as though they were a problem to solve. Yet beneath the disappointment was something else. Clarity. The uncertainty was disappearing. Piece by piece, the truth was becoming visible. Later that afternoon, I carried the documents into Harold's study. As I organized them beside the appraisal report, my eyes landed on a small wooden box sitting on the bookshelf. Harold kept important papers there for years. Tax records. Insurance policies. Estate documents. I opened the box and began sorting through its contents. Most of the files were exactly what I expected. Then I found a folder labeled Estate Planning Updates. Harold's handwriting covered the tab. My pulse quickened slightly. Inside were several letters, legal summaries, and meeting notes from our attorney. One document had been highlighted. A sticky note attached to the front contained only 6 words written in Harold's familiar handwriting. If necessary, call Daniel first. Daniel. The name immediately sounded familiar. After several moments, I remembered. Daniel Brooks. Harold's attorney and longtime friend. We had not spoken in nearly a year. I stared at the note while memories surfaced. Harold trusted very few people completely. Daniel was one of them. The longer I looked at that handwritten reminder, the more convinced I became that it was not there by accident. Harold rarely left loose ends. If he wanted me to contact Daniel under certain circumstances, there was a reason. I picked up the telephone from the corner of the desk and looked at the number written beside Daniel's name. Then I smiled softly. Ryan and Emily believed they were patiently guiding events toward a future they had already imagined. What they did not know was that Harold had spent years preparing for possibilities they never considered. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt as though I was finally walking toward answers instead of chasing questions. The next morning, I called Daniel Brooks. The moment he answered, I recognized the same calm voice I remembered from years ago. Harold always trusted people who listened more than they talked, and Daniel had been one of those people. After exchanging a few pleasantries, I explained why I was calling. I mentioned the documents I had found. I mentioned the appraisal. I mentioned the notes discussing my future as though I were not part of the conversation. Daniel listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief pause on the line. Then he sighed softly. I was wondering if this day might come, he said. Those words immediately captured my attention. I sat straighter in my chair. What do you mean? Another pause followed. About 2 years before Harold passed away, he asked me a very unusual question, Daniel replied. He wanted to know what options existed to protect a surviving spouse from family pressure involving major assets. I looked around Harold's study. Sunlight filtered through the window and illuminated the dust drifting through the air. Suddenly, I felt as though Harold was sitting somewhere nearby, quietly watching events unfold exactly as he expected. Daniel continued. At the time, there was no specific problem. Harold never accused anyone of anything. But he believed in preparing before problems appeared rather than after. That sounded exactly like my husband. If a storm was forecast for Saturday, Harold checked the roof on Thursday. If the car needed maintenance next month, he scheduled it this month. Preparation was simply part of who he was. Did he make any changes? I asked. Daniel laughed softly. Several. My heart skipped a beat. What kind of changes? That is a conversation best held in person, he replied. But I think you should know something important. Harold wanted you protected. Not controlled. Protected. The distinction mattered more than I could explain. After ending the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. The uncertainty that had followed me since Thanksgiving was slowly transforming into understanding. Every discovery pointed in the same direction. Harold had seen possibilities long before I did. More importantly, he had acted on them. Later that afternoon, Ryan called again. His timing almost made me smile. He asked about my weekend. He asked whether I needed groceries. Then, as expected, the conversation drifted toward the house. Emily found information about a few really nice communities nearby, he said casually. Places with maintenance services and social activities. I walked to the window and looked across the backyard. The bird feeder Harold built still stood beside the fence. Fresh snow dusted the grass. That is thoughtful, I replied. You should take a look sometime, Ryan continued. No pressure. Just options. No pressure. That phrase stayed with me after the call ended. It reminded me of something Daniel had said only hours earlier. Protect a surviving spouse from family pressure involving major assets. Suddenly, I realized something important. Pressure does not always arrive through demands. Sometimes it arrives through suggestions repeated often enough to sound inevitable. Through conversations designed to guide rather than force. Through assumptions disguised as concern. Over the following week, I received 3 separate brochures in the mail. All featured retirement communities. All had been forwarded from Ryan and Emily. The messages attached sounded caring. Helpful. Practical. Yet every brochure represented the same idea. Leave the house. Move on. Simplify. I thanked them politely each time. Then I placed the brochures in a drawer beside the appraisal and the handwritten notes. By now, a pattern had become impossible to ignore. They believed they were gradually leading me toward a decision. What they did not realize was that every suggestion only strengthened my resolve to understand exactly why Harold spent so much time preparing for this moment. And soon, I would finally learn what he had done. The meeting with Daniel took place the following Tuesday afternoon. His office sat inside a red brick building near the courthouse, a place Harold and I had visited several times over the years. As I walked through the familiar doorway, I felt an odd combination of nervousness and comfort. So much of the past few weeks had been filled with questions. For the first time, I sensed that real answers were finally waiting for me. Daniel greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. A thick folder rested on the table beside a legal pad and 2 cups of coffee. The moment I saw the folder, I knew this conversation would be important. We exchanged a few memories about Harold before turning to business. Then Daniel opened the folder and removed several documents. Your husband was one of the most thorough people I have ever worked with, he said. He believed that preparation was an act of love. I smiled softly. That sounded exactly like Harold. Daniel slid the first document toward me. It was part of an estate planning package that Harold had updated shortly after his retirement. As Daniel explained the details, a picture slowly began to emerge. Harold had created legal protections designed to ensure that major decisions involving the house and other family assets could not be influenced by outside pressure. More importantly, he had structured everything in a way that preserved my authority over those decisions. Nobody could simply persuade me into giving up control. Nobody could quietly redirect ownership through a series of conversations. The safeguards were clear, deliberate, comprehensive. I listened carefully while Daniel explained each provision. Then he showed me a handwritten letter Harold had left with the file. My breath caught the moment I recognized the handwriting. The letter was addressed to me. Not for immediate delivery. Only if circumstances made it necessary. Daniel waited quietly while I read. The message was simple. Harold wrote that he trusted me completely, but he also understood how vulnerable grief can make a person. He knew that people often make major decisions during periods of loss simply because they want the discomfort to end. He asked me to take my time. To trust my instincts. To remember that a home built over decades deserved more consideration than a conversation held over a holiday dinner. By the time I finished reading, my eyes were filled with tears. Not because I felt sad. Because I felt understood. Even after everything that had happened, Harold still seemed to know exactly what I needed. Daniel handed me a tissue and smiled. "There is one more thing," he said. He opened another section of the folder and pointed to a specific provision. According to the updated structure, any proposal involving the sale, transfer, or major disposition of the property required direct approval from me and independent review through the trust arrangement Harold had established. In practical terms, nobody could move the process forward without my willing participation. Nobody. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt completely calm. The fear that had quietly followed me for weeks disappeared. Ryan and Emily may have discussed plans. They may have explored possibilities. They may have convinced themselves that the future was already taking shape. But the truth was much simpler. The future remained mine to decide. As the meeting ended, Daniel handed me copies of the documents and walked me to the lobby. Before I left, he paused and said something I would remember for a long time. Harold did not build these protections because he expected the worst from people. He built them because he wanted the best for you. The drive home felt different. The roads were the same. The town was the same. Yet everything looked clearer somehow. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment and looked at the house. The porch. The windows. The swing in the backyard. It was more than property. It was a life. And now, for the first time since discovering the appraisal, I was no longer waiting for the truth to reveal itself. I knew it. The only question remaining was when Ryan and Emily would finally decide to reveal their plan openly. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. 2 days after my meeting with Daniel, Ryan called and asked whether he and Emily could stop by on Sunday afternoon. His voice carried an unusual mixture of confidence and nervousness. I already knew why they wanted to come. The timing was too convenient. The brochures. The conversations. The appraisal. Everything had been moving toward this moment for weeks. When Sunday arrived, I prepared coffee and set out a plate of cookies the same way I always did when family visited. Snow covered the lawn outside, and the bare branches of the maple tree cast long shadows across the yard. Shortly after 2 o'clock, Ryan and Emily arrived. Their smiles seemed genuine enough, but I noticed how quickly they settled into the conversation they had clearly rehearsed beforehand. At first, we discussed ordinary things. The grandchildren. Holiday shopping. School events. Then the topic gradually shifted. Ryan mentioned how difficult it must be to maintain a large property alone. Emily talked about convenience, safety, and future planning. Every sentence sounded reasonable. Thoughtful, even. Yet I could see the destination they were steering toward long before they arrived there. Finally, Ryan placed his coffee cup on the table and leaned forward. "Mom, we wanted to talk about something important." I nodded. "I figured you might." He glanced briefly at Emily before continuing. We have been thinking about what would be best for you long term. There it was. The conversation they had been building toward since Thanksgiving. Emily opened a folder she had brought with her. Inside were brochures, property information, and several printed pages. One glance was enough to recognize the same real estate consultant whose business card I had found attached to the appraisal. My heartbeat remained perfectly steady. Months earlier, this discovery might have upset me. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. Ryan explained their proposal. Sell the house. Purchase a smaller residence closer to them. Simplify my responsibilities. Free up resources. Create flexibility for the future. The presentation was polished. Organized. Carefully prepared. When he finished, both of them looked at me expectantly. They believed they had reached the final step. They believed all the groundwork had been completed. What they did not realize was that I had been several steps ahead for quite some time. I folded my hands and smiled gently. You put a lot of effort into this. Relief immediately appeared on their faces. They mistook calmness for agreement. Emily smiled. We only want what is best for you. I nodded slowly. I know. Then I stood and walked into Harold's study. When I returned a moment later, I carried a folder of my own. I placed it carefully on the table and opened it. Inside were copies of the trust documents Daniel had reviewed with me. I explained, calmly and without accusation, that Harold had established extensive protections years earlier. I explained that every major decision involving the property remained entirely under my control. I explained that independent oversight existed specifically to ensure those decisions reflected my wishes alone. As I spoke, the expressions across the table began to change. Confusion appeared first. Then surprise. Then understanding. Neither interrupted. Neither argued. They simply listened. By the time I finished, the room had become very quiet. The plan they believed was approaching completion had encountered a reality they never expected. Not because Harold distrusted them. Because he understood that important decisions deserve patience, clarity, and freedom from influence. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Ryan lowered his eyes and slowly exhaled. And in that silence, I realized that the conversation had finally reached the truth. Ryan remained silent for several seconds after I finished speaking. The confidence that had carried him through the conversation was gone. Across the table, Emily stared at the documents resting in front of her. Neither of them looked angry. They looked surprised. Not by the fact that protections existed, but by how thoroughly Harold had prepared them. Eventually, Ryan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. Dad really thought of everything, he said quietly. I smiled softly. He usually did. The tension in the room gradually faded. Without accusations to defend against and without assumptions left to support, there was very little left to argue about. The truth had a way of simplifying things. We spent the next hour talking more honestly than we had in months. Ryan admitted that he and Emily believed they were helping. They worried about my future. They worried about the responsibilities of maintaining a large property alone. Some of those concerns were genuine. Others had become mixed with expectations they never fully examined. Expectations about timing. Expectations about decisions. Expectations about what would eventually happen. I listened carefully. Then I explained something they had failed to understand. The house was never just a financial asset to me. It was where Ryan took his first steps. It was where birthday candles were blown out year after year. It was where Harold and I built an entire life together, one ordinary day at a time. People looking at spreadsheets saw value. I saw memories. Neither perspective was completely wrong. But one perspective belonged to the people who lived the story. As the afternoon came to an end, Ryan apologized. Not dramatically. Not with grand speeches. Simply and sincerely. He admitted that some conversations should have included me from the beginning. Emily nodded in agreement. It was not a perfect resolution. Real families rarely receive perfect resolutions. But it was honest. And honesty was enough. After they left, I carried the trust documents back into Harold's study and returned them to the drawer where they belonged. Then I walked through the house slowly, room by room. The winter sunlight had begun fading outside. Long shadows stretched across the floors. The familiar creak of the staircase echoed through the quiet rooms. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet somehow everything felt different. The uncertainty that had followed me since Thanksgiving was finally gone. For weeks, I had wondered whether I was imagining things. Whether grief was clouding my judgment. Whether the strange feeling in the back of my mind was simply loneliness. It was not. My instincts had been right all along. More importantly, Harold had trusted those instincts enough to protect them. A few days later, I made a decision of my own. Not because anyone pressured me. Not because anyone suggested it. Because I wanted to. I hired a local contractor to make several updates around the house. New porch railings. Better lighting. A few repairs that Harold and I had discussed for years but never completed. The work took several weeks. By the time spring arrived, the house felt refreshed without losing any of its history. One warm evening in April, I carried a cup of coffee onto the back porch and sat alone watching the sunset. The maple tree had begun growing leaves again. Birds moved between the branches. The backyard glowed with the soft golden light Harold always loved. As I sat there, I found myself thinking about that Thanksgiving dinner. The empty chair. The uneasy feeling. The conversations I was never meant to hear. Strange as it sounded, I no longer felt grateful that I discovered the truth. I felt grateful that the truth gave me clarity. Ryan knew what the neighborhood would say if anyone found out about those 2 weeks. If he'd been negotiating a sale before talking to me, his reputation as a responsible son-in-law was finished. It showed me who needed guidance. It showed me who needed patience. Most of all, it reminded me that love and wisdom are not always loud. Sometimes they appear years later in the form of preparations quietly made by someone who understood exactly what the future might require. The chair at the end of the dining table remained empty. It always would. But when I looked at it now, I no longer saw loss. I saw a final gift from the man who spent 43 years taking care of our family. And for the first time since he was gone, the empty chair no longer felt lonely. It felt like proof that some promises continue long after the person who made them is no longer there to speak them.